Thank you very much. I'm Dimitri Zenghelis, and I'm an economist. It does sound like a confession, and I'm afraid it is. The world is about to undergo a revolution. Our economies are about to become decarbonized. And I'm going to argue that economists have failed to predict the scale of this revolution, the degree to which we are going to transition to a low-carbon economy. I'm going to argue that economists not only get the future wrong, but economists make the future wrong. To the extent that we are believed, we become part of the problem. To understand this, we have to understand a little bit about the underlying problem of climate change. Greenhouse gases which cause climate change sit in the atmosphere for decades, in some cases hundreds of years. This means it's the stock of greenhouse gases that causes climate change, not the annual flow, not the annual emissions. So if you want to control the temperature, you have to stabilize the stock. It doesn't matter whether you want to control it to 2 degrees, which is where what our world leaders agreed to in Paris a couple of years ago, 4 degrees or 6 degrees or toast degrees. You have to bring emissions, the annual flow, close to zero to stabilize the stock. And we can either do this the easy way by managing that transition, or we can do this the hard way by generating such a hostile climate it severely compromises humanity's ability to exist on the planet. So, well, let's say we were to try and meet the globally agreed target of 2 degrees. How much more carbon could we squeeze into the atmosphere without breaching that ceiling? And that's what the little blue circle shows on this chart. These are just scaled circles. And what you see in the black circle is the amount of readily accessible fossil fuel reserves, coal, oil, gas, that you can extract easily from the ground. Most of that, if we're to meet the 2-degree target, has to stay in the ground. Or if we burn it, we have to capture the carbon. This is revolutionary. The economy of the world will very quickly shift from fossil fuels to renewables and energy efficiency, and I hope to explain why. This is going to touch all of us. This isn't just the fossil fuel companies that are going to feel this. So, an obvious question then at this stage is, given that we've got to make such a large transformation, how much is it going to cost? Well, that's easy. This is where economists come in. They can tell you the answer, and there it is. Don't try and read it, okay? You're not going to make any more sense out of it than I am. Bizarrely enough, this is the summary table and the summary for policymakers from the International Panel of Climate Change, the most authoritative and respected body in the field of climate economics and climate studies. And what it says is that in 2100, the cost of meeting a 2-degree target every year is going to be of the order of 2.9 to 11.4% of GDP. So there you have it. Thank you. Wait a minute. This is nonsense, right? I mean, alarm bells should begin to ring when you see the comedy decimal place. We struggle to predict GDP 2-3 years ahead, let alone 80+ years ahead. This is a period over which the world economy will have expanded by between 300 and 900%. So already something's not right, but this just doesn't pass the sniff test. Let's think about what we're saying here, right? This is a scenario where from tomorrow, we all aim to meet the 2-degree target. We put the best minds in the world, our most creative innovators, our best entrepreneurs. We spend billions, maybe trillions of dollars in investment in these renewables, and we have a perfect policy framework with a single global carbon price. And yet it's still more expensive in every single scenario to employ people in far-flung parts of the world, to dig this stuff up, to put these fossil fuels on ships, in pipes, on trains, transport them halfway around the world, burn them in 19th century technology, and in most cases lose much, if not most of that energy on the grid. And that apparently is going to be cheaper than actually extracting this stuff for free from the wind, from the sun, and from the oceans. It just doesn't pass the sniff test. Okay, there'll be difficult bits, for sure. In buildings, in industry, in land use and forestry, it's going to be very difficult to squeeze carbon out of those sectors. But transport and energy, it really isn't that much of a challenge. Economists get this wrong all the time. They fail to understand the rate of deployment that we see in these renewable technologies. This is a chart from the International Energy Agency, one of the most respected organizations in this field. The red line shows the actual rate of deployment in electrical capacity. The other lines show you the forecasts that the IA put out. They don't just get it wrong in 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years. They get it wrong year after year after year after year. I mean, you all know Einstein's definition of madness, right? It's repeating the same thing and expecting different results. Well, that's what they're doing. Unfortunately, this is a disaster, Because one of the key elements of technological revolutions is what is called learning by doing. When you learn through deployment, you learn to make your innovations better. You experiment with them. You learn through good practice. You engineer them better, and so on. And the costs come down, and the productivity and efficiency of the products goes up. The IA understand learning by doing, but like most economists, they've really misunderstood the amount of doing. And this is a disaster, because you miss out this. This chart's a little busy, but what it shows are two of the leading renewable technologies, solar photovoltaic on the left and wind power on the right. The cost of solar photovoltaic have come down by a factor of 5 in as many years. Now, wind is a more mature technology, but the costs of wind power have also halved over the same period. Both are now what's called close to grid parity. That is, they are fully competitive with oil, with coal, and with gas. Okay, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, so we need some kind of storage to bridge the intermittency. Well, the good news is that lithium-ion battery costs have also fallen by about 40% over the same period, with very encouraging and exciting new innovations in battery storage on the way. It's not just energy. Most big auto manufacturers have now stopped spending money on research and development in the combustion engine. They've got narrow research budgets. It's almost all going into electric vehicles. The combustion engine is over. The era of the combustion engine car has finished. This is a revolution. It is a transformation. Why do economists get it so wrong? Why don't they understand how quickly we are deploying these things? Well, the answer is reasonably simple. They miss out the key linkages between investment, innovation, behaviors, and cultures. These feedback mechanisms that means that when a revolution happens, it can happen a lot faster than you otherwise predicted. And as a result, they overestimate the costs of the revolution and they underestimate its scale. Let me give you an example. Many of you will have been to Copenhagen or to Amsterdam. And you go there and you ask, you see that everybody cycles. And you ask people, well, why do you all cycle? And they'll usually tell you something along the lines of, well, we have fantastic cycling infrastructure. And you look around and true enough, they do. And then you might follow up and ask, well, how comes you have such great cycling infrastructure? And at this point, they start to look at you as if you're a bit thick. And they say, well, everybody here cycles. Well, all right, it doesn't really matter which came first, the chicken or the egg. You can tell a similar story with renewable vehicles. If you want to buy a renewable vehicle, you want to know that there's electric charging points and not petrol stations. But if you want somebody to build electric charging points and not petrol stations, you need to know that there's enough people driving electric vehicles. You've got these network effects you need to tap into. But expectations are what drives this change. In both cases, expectations really matter. Economists tend to miss this out. Social psychologists, on the other hand, have known for years that if you want to solve complex coordination problems like climate change, you need to manage and understand expectations. Likes and dislikes are not fixed. They are influenceable. Social norms, they're not fixed. They're influenceable. Technologies, they're not fixed. They're influenceable. And they all feed off each other in this fantastic spiral. This has been a problem for some time for economists, and it's something that we really need to understand. Imagine, for example, that you're a mayor or a politician or a business leader, and you're thinking of investing heavily or pushing for policies to invest heavily in renewables and energy efficiency. And you think everybody else is going to do this. And you actually think nobody else is going to do this, right? So you expect the technology costs to stay high, you expect the financing to be niche, and you don't see any huge market opportunities. Now, say all things remain the same, but actually you now expect everybody else is going to move into this very rapidly. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Everyone and their dog wants a piece of it. Suddenly, you expect the technology costs to come down very quickly. The financing will become mainstream. And you see these fantastic new market opportunities, so you invest. And so does everybody else. And the very process of investing generates the deployment that brings the cost down, that makes it more attractive. You start this virtuous spiral. You reach this tipping point. And note that nothing has changed here except people's expectations in both scenarios. It's psychology. It's in the head. And this is what economists tend to miss out. And that's exactly what we've seen happening on the world political stage over the last 10 years. Some of you will remember 10 years ago, the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change, which raised hopes and aspirations of an ambitious deal, but it failed. Why did it fail? Because at the time, the language was about cost. It was about burden sharing. It was about sacrifice. It was about everyone pulling their weight to save the planet. And of course, what you got was distrust. Everyone wanted to free ride on the actions of others. People waited for other people to move, and you got a race to the bottom, and no deal, or at least not an ambitious deal, emerged. Wind the clock forward 8 years to Paris, and we have that ambitious deal. And what's more, it's voluntary. And that deal is based on an understanding that there are opportunities. And let me explain why that is. Well, for a start, we've seen the technology costs come down, and that changes the equation commercially quite substantially. We've also begun to understand that there are substantial gains from energy efficiency. By definition, that saves you money. But there are other benefits as well. Pollution. The World Health Organization and the World Bank together estimate that the cost of pollution through death, through ill health, through hours lost out of work in a country like China amounts to something like 12% of annual GDP. 12%. I mean, that is literally metaphorically eye-watering, excuse the pun. In the European Union, it's of the order of 5 to 7%. These are not trivial numbers. If we dedicated that amount of resources every year to solving climate change, we'd probably have this licked in a matter of decades. But it doesn't stop there. Once the private sector and businesses got a whiff of the opportunities associated with this kind of change, they also began to see reason to act and reason to invest. Don't squint too hard at this. The only thing you need to note here is the figure of 6 million. This is an advert that went out in the Financial Times just prior to the Paris Agreement in 2015, and it says 6 million companies around the world want an ambitious climate deal at the conference in Paris that December. This is 6 million companies seeing opportunity and money and profit. These are new lobbies, new voices to counter the existing lobbies in fossil fuels. They will have influence on political systems that will change policies, that will change investments. And it's no surprise, world trade in renewable sectors has outpaced world trade in other sectors by double since the financial crash. Sustainable sectors have outperformed the market by about 10% over the same period, whereas those sectors that are deeply entrenched in fossil fuels have lagged the S&P 500 by, in some cases, a very large margin. This is a commercial opportunity, and it's commercial opportunities together with things like pollution, but it's mostly the commercial opportunities of fabricating, manufacturing, exporting this kind of kit in solar, in wind, and other sectors that led the Chinese to agree a comprehensive landmark deal with the Americans the year prior to Paris. And now you see where we're going with this, right? We've got China moving with ambitious decarbonization. We've got the US cutting emissions, and we've got Europe cutting emissions. That's 3/4 of the world. The rest of the world just has to pay attention because this is going to happen. This is where the new markets are. And it's no surprise, therefore, that a year later, you had this ambitious and comprehensive deal in Paris to try and limit temperatures to 2 degrees with an aspiration to keep them below 1.5. Now, I saw quite a few of you, or I sensed quite a few of you straining there with that picture of Obama, and you're kind of thinking under your breath, going, yeah, right, look at it now. Actually, Donald Trump is another example of why the momentum is unstoppable. 10 years ago, if the US had failed to show leadership on this, the Indians, the Chinese, and others would have said, well, you know what? You're one of the richest countries, one of the biggest emitters. If you're not going to be paying for this, well, we're certainly not going to handicap our economies to pay for this, and the whole process would have stopped. We've not seen that this time. It's been very different. The US has talked about backpedaling. China, India, Europe, and the rest of the world have said, well, fine, we're going to move on regardless with our voluntary agreements. Why? Because they no longer see this as a cost. They see it as an opportunity. They see this as a chance to steal a march on the American competitors who are hamstringing themselves by slowing down in creating the new technologies, the new goods and services for the fastest growing market in the world. All of this stuff, all of this expectations, all of these feedbacks, these tipping points, these understanding that you can invest in physical assets and that changes mindsets, it changes cultures, it changes institutions, is what economists tend to miss out. And so they overestimate the cost of this revolution. And like I've said already, they tend to underestimate the scale. Now, don't get me wrong. Economic models have a very important role to play. They enforce a discipline on the modeler to be very clear on their assumptions. They impose some degree of internal consistency, and they're good descriptions of the workings of the economy. And so they act as very good sources of simulations for risks in an as-if world. What if things develop like this? How might the world look like? But they're useless at forecasting, because all they tell you is the prior assumptions of the forecaster who makes the assumptions on the things you care about, like I said at the beginning. There's plenty that economists can do to help in this story. We can look at the risks. We can try and help in assessing how much money should be put into research and development, into deployment. We can try and formulate the standards and regulations. We can help design our cities to make them more efficient. But economists really need to learn the lesson that if they're to stay relevant to this most important story, they have to spend a lot less time trying to predict the future and a lot more time helping design it. Thank you.